There are a lot of questions that people tend to have around therapy and the therapeutic process, a lot of fears, a lot of doubts. Today, I want to take a little bit of time and address a couple of things that I think are really important to keep in mind when you think about the therapeutic process overall and really healing generally. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me. There's a good chance that you've maybe had some of these questions or fears before as well. And if you are finding that you're struggling with any of it, I hope that it helps. And even if you're not struggling with it now, but you have in the past, I hope it helps you recognize that those doubts or fears that you've had are really normal. And I think that can be important because when we feel like we've struggled with something that we shouldn't struggle with, it can add to the level of vulnerability that we tend to feel in different aspects of relationships and vulnerability and trust and that sort of thing. So one of the things that comes up a lot is in the therapeutic process is the relationship or choosing a therapist. And I have talked about this before, but I want to reiterate this again because it is something that people ask quite often. And I know that I have talked a lot about what I think is important to look for in a therapist if you're a survivor of childhood trauma. So I want to just reiterate again that the nature of the relationship that you have with your therapist is oftentimes more important than the method or mode of therapy that they use. In fact, most times I would say that. It's more important than certainly the degree that that person has. Now, I do think, generally speaking, they need to have a degree associated with some sort of mental health type of thing, training, lengthy training at least in that regard, very specific. And I do certainly encourage that anybody that you might work with have specific experience and training in working with survivors of childhood trauma. But it's important for you to be able to feel as safe as possible with that person because that lays the foundation or helps strengthen the foundation for all the work that you're doing together, whatever that might be. It also lays the foundation for the work that you do outside of therapy. And that's the other thing that I want to talk about. So the work that you do outside of therapy may vary depending on kind of how your therapist might approach therapy and healing. It also will vary depending on you and what you choose to do outside of therapy. But one of the things that comes up quite often is that people will feel discouraged, sometimes feeling like their therapist isn't asking the right questions or isn't providing enough specific advice or suggestions, isn't talking enough or is talking too much or whatever it might be. And those things are important and valid and important to be able to process, ideally with your therapist. So there is work that happens when you are actually in that space together, whether it's 45 minutes or 50 minutes or 60 minutes or 90 minutes or even 2 hours. 2 hours is not very typical. 90 minutes really isn't even very typical. But that time matters. And I would say probably the most significant thing that happens in that time is you learning to feel safe in that relationship. you learning that you can take risks in sharing things and be accepted and supported and believed. During that time together, I really think that generally speaking, those are the most important things that are happening in your time together. And there is healing in that. That is absolutely a moment of a healing experience, and that will continue to build on itself over time. So I absolutely am not discounting that. That is important. It matters. You learn, hopefully, stuff, or hopefully you learn stuff. You get to talk about different things. You get to share different things. You get feedback on things or whatever. All of that is important. But with all of that, learning to feel safe, risking being vulnerable, being accepted and supported, and recognizing it's okay to be vulnerable. That's the most important thing that's coming out of that. The majority of your work, the majority of your healing is happening in your time outside of therapy, because that is where you are living your life, right? For most people, therapy is maybe one time a week for maybe an hour. You've got a whole lot of hours in your week that are not with your therapist. They're interacting with strangers, and you're doing work of some sort, even if it's volunteering or raising children or whatever it might be. There's some sort of activities that you're very involved in. There are hobbies maybe that you're involved in. There's relationships that you're involved in. There's tasks that you have to get done. There's so much time with your thoughts, right? So your life is happening outside of that time with your therapist. And in that time outside of that, so in your life, that's where things are happening that tend to affirm the things that you believe, those core beliefs. That's where things are happening in conversations or in relationships that are reinforcing or hopefully also helping you shift a little bit about what you maybe expect or fear in relationships. There are things happening that either are affirming what you believe you're capable of, or maybe things that you're doing that are helping you see that you are capable and are already doing so many more things than you give yourself credit for. And all of those things are either reinforcing the beliefs, the false beliefs, or they are helping you release them and begin to believe something different. And that happens in large part from practicing, right? I've talked about practicing a lot. Healing is a process and a practice. Healing doesn't happen without both of those things so many times that you could never count. And so often, well, I would say all the time in the beginning, you have to be really mindful of those practices. So one of the examples I just gave is like in a relationship, in a conversation in a relationship. So it's very natural if you fear abandonment or believe that you're unworthy or feel particularly vulnerable. Let's say it's a friend that you're really close to or that you really respect and value, or maybe even a romantic relationship. You could be in a conversation and that person could say something that maybe is even pretty neutral. But depending on what's going on with you, you may interpret what that person is saying in a particular way that brings up this really intense sort of emotion, it makes you believe that what they're saying has something to do with not thinking that you're a good person, that they don't want to be around you, that they don't like you, that they think certain bad things about you. And that is unfortunately really natural and normal for most of us that experience childhood trauma until we get to a certain place in healing. Because all of that comes from ultimately believing that you're unworthy. So part of the practice in a situation like that, and it takes time to be able to get there. It takes other little practices along the way. But part of the practice then is noticing what's happening for you, noticing the physiological response that's happening in your body, noticing any fears or doubts, thoughts that are present, and being able to do some self-talk, whether that is just somewhat like an affirmation, not just a regular affirmation like I am worthy, but like just kind of affirming that that this is kind of your historical response to fear, to abandonment, to rejection, to hurt, whatever it might be. So being able to talk yourself through it ultimately, part of that might also be doing some reality testing. That is part of the practice that you need to be able to do in your regular everyday life. And this can happen even, let's say you're, working on something, you're typing up a paper of some sort or something, and you're having difficulty focusing, or you're making a lot of mistakes. You might actually say something to yourself that is really quite negative, that's reinforcing some of those false beliefs. So that practice would come in there as well. And really these practices, they're not going to happen automatically. Your therapist is maybe going to talk to you about it, like, I would suggest doing this, or have you tried this, or this is something that tends to help, or whatever it is. You're going to maybe learn that idea in therapy, or here even. But learning it somewhere and then being able to apply it, they're not the same. Not at all are they the same. Of course, you can never apply it if you don't learn it, but just because you learn it doesn't mean you're going to be able to apply it. Part of the practice is having to notice what's happening, take a breath, be intentional, like recalling, okay, I'm going to try this, or I need to try this, or here's something I can try. However, you're going to say that to yourself. But you have to be aware of what's happening first, and that is a practice as well. Because generally speaking, that whole experience happens so automatically that often we're not even aware that it's happening, especially in the moment. We may notice afterward having lots of thoughts or feelings or whatever, but sometimes in the moment, we're not really aware of what's happening. So sometimes just becoming aware is a lot of the practicing that you have to do. And then practicing being intentional about trying to do some of those things. And again, it's one thing to have that awareness, like, okay, I can do this, or I want to do this, or I should do this, or whatever. It's one thing to think it. It's another thing to actually act on it. If you think about eating healthy, right? I think most of us know certain things that we might eat that aren't all that great for us. Doesn't mean that we're going to immediately just suddenly stop eating it, right? Well, it's different on some levels, but it's really not any different in this aspect. And that's why it is a practice. There are so many seemingly really small things that are actually really important practices along this entire journey. And what will happen often is that people will feel really frustrated with themselves. It will reinforce an idea that they can't heal, that it's hopeless, that they're not deserving of healing, that they're not capable of healing, whatever it is, because they're not able to do the thing that they think that they need to do. Or maybe they've done it for a few times, but then they forget, or they're not able to act on it. That is not at all the reality. Practicing is something that you will continue to do, because sometimes you're going to be better at it than others. I've talked about this before, but the idea of yoga being a practice, right? So even people that are experienced yoga practitioners, some days their body just isn't having it. And I'm not a really experienced or practiced yoga person. I do yoga, but there are some days that my body just does not want to move. I'm more stiff. My balance isn't as good, or whatever it is. So it's a practice. So even though you might get to a place where things are going really well, it's still a practice, because some days it's not. So the practicing, in whatever way that looks, the practicing is where so much of the actual healing, the steps up that mountain, those steps are the practicing that you're doing. Every time you practice, you're moving up that mountain. Sometimes it may be a very small step. Sometimes it might be huge leaps. But every time that you practice, it helps the next time, or the 10th time after, feel easier, more natural, more impactful. And it's going to ebb and flow. It's not a linear process. Just like with yoga, some days are going to be better than others. And there's a lot of factors that go into it, and none of those are anything to do with you being able to do it, you being capable ultimately. Certainly not anything to do with you being worthy or deserving. And when you end up feeling like you're judging or beating yourself up because you know what to do but you're not doing it, or you were able to do it and now you're not, or you should be further along than you are, every time you have those thoughts, it is reinforcing the sense of being unworthy or undeserving or incapable. It significantly is affirming those ideas, those beliefs. So it's not taking a step back, but like if you're thinking about walking up a mountain, every time that you have those thoughts associated with those false beliefs, it's as if there's this force holding you back and you're trying to move forward. So it's not that you can't, it's that there's this force holding you back. And we can't just make ourselves stop thinking the things that we have believed throughout our entire lives. I wish that there was a way that we could. So whether it's about expectation or feeling uncertain about whether you're ever going to be able to get to where you want to be, recognize that everything that you are doing is moving you further up that mountain, even when it's feeling that you are being held back. So the idea that healing is happening outside of the therapy room, that is why. Yes, you might be able to have a conversation with your therapist. Maybe, your therapist said something that didn't land well with you and you have a conversation about it and it goes well appropriately. That is going to be a healing experience. So there are important things that happen with your therapist, without a doubt. But the things that you do outside of there, that's where you see, well, actually it's hard to see, so you may not see it, but that's where the healing is, the majority of your healing is happening outside of that therapy. One of the reasons that I think having somebody guide you on this journey is because it is very hard for you to see it. Sometimes I think it can even be impossible for you to be able to see any sort of progress at all. And I know for me, I think a big part of what I do is helping people see that, recognize it, honor it. Because when you can see that you are practicing, that you are taking steps up that mountain, it gives you more trust and confidence within yourself and your capacity for healing. And if we don't specifically recognize the practicing and the progress that's happening, it's natural to believe, to continue to believe that you're not actually making any progress, because the only things that you're able to really see that feel very real are things that are affirming that you're not making progress, that you're not worthy. And that happens because of those false beliefs, cognitive dissonance, right? When you believe that you're unworthy, anything that you can take that would seem to suggest that that is true, you're going to hold on to that. And this isn't a conscious thing that you're doing. You're not choosing to do this. It's just an automatic process. It's the way that our minds work. You're going to take that as confirmation and evidence that what you believe is true. There are many things in your likely daily life that could suggest, if not prove, that what you believe about yourself is not true. What you believe about what you're capable of is not true. What you believe about how people feel about you is not true. But because it doesn't fit with what you believe, sometimes it's almost as if you literally don't hear it, or if you do hear it, you immediately dismiss it. Whether you just completely ignore it, or you say they don't really mean it, they're just being nice, maybe even feel defensive in a sense because it feels too risky to think that maybe they do mean it. So you might even think, what are they wanting from me? So anything that could go against what you already believe doesn't register. We don't internalize it because it doesn't fit with that. So much of the practicing, because ultimately healing is about changing what you believe about who you are. And I've talked about how the meaning that we attach to the trauma is what creates the long-term impact. And that is very much related to what we believe about who we are. And healing, the foundation of healing is changing what you believe about who you are, because then there is no shame. Then you believe that you're worthy. It doesn't mean you believe you're perfect, but you believe that you're worthy. You're much more willing to take risks in different kinds of situations because you know that there really isn't any failing in it, right? So all of that is the practice. It's the process of healing. And ultimately, I hope that you do think of this as just, I don't know, like a support talk, confirmation, whatever, about the reality that there is so much more that you have the ability to create for yourself than you likely believe right now that you do. And getting to the place where you can believe that is part of what healing is. Probably a big part. So, I do hope that you found this helpful. If you have any questions about the therapeutic process, the healing process, any of what I shared today, leave the questions in the comments. I'm happy to talk about any aspect of any of this. Please know that no matter how much you've worked on healing, if you're not yet where you want to be, no matter what your experiences have been in terms of trauma or in previous healing experiences, no matter how much doubt you might have, I truly believe that you have the ability and the capacity. You have within you what you need to heal, and you deserve to heal. Anybody watching this who has experienced trauma, you deserve to heal, no matter what you have said to yourself over the years as to why you don't deserve to heal. Whatever that might look or sound like, you do deserve to heal. Thank you for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.